All right, welcome back to the beautiful Pacific Northwest, the land of plaid and coffee, and PacWest Bigfoot. So here we go. Real quick before I get started, at any time, if you'd like to support the old channel here, PacWest Bigfoot, if you would. If you're here on YouTube, you can click on the old eye, hover over the video, and click on the eye up here in the left-hand. Well, actually, I guess it'd be the right-hand corner for you. Click on there and sign up and subscribe. And if you're on the Facebook page, go ahead and click on the old sign up button. You can find it right there. I want to say thank you so very much and greatly appreciate it. And anything else going on right now? Not really. I'm kind of getting back to putting these encounter stories, these reports and encounters that you give me, and turning them into these awesome little campfire-like stories for you. Getting back into the swing of doing these things every single week, and unless it's kind of a holiday or maybe I'm sick or something, so there you go. But for the most part, here we go, and I am going to be doing that. So let's get on with this week's Bigfoot encounter story. Man tells of lifelong Bigfoot experiences in Sixes, Oregon. Hey Dave, this is Rob. I'm sure my friend Pat has sent you his experience with Bigfoot in and around Sixes, Oregon. Well, here is mine. I know that you turn these reports and encounters into campfire-like short stories for us, but with this one, well, I think you'll get to save some time with any additions and embellishments, as this all happened over the period of nearly 30 years. As I said, I live in Sixes still to this day, and yes, Pat and I do a lot of research out here, and for good reason, as you will learn. Bigfoot of Sixes, Oregon. I was born in Klamath Falls, but raised in Sixes, Oregon. My parents moved here when I was almost 9 years old. I was homeschooled, and after that set out for a degree in biology, which I received from UC Davis in Northern California many, many years ago. I am also a believer in the good Lord above like you and my best friend Pat, and I do not believe that this animal is anything more than just that, an animal, a part of the great apes that has survived all this time. Today, with my friend Pat, we both do our own research for ourselves, but I did, like him, enjoy your format, Dave. So I decided to let you take these encounters of mine and make them, well, more fun and interesting than I probably could. So here it is. A Life with Bigfoot. Growing up, I knew a Bigfoot at a very early age living in Sixes, Oregon. My last close-up encounter, and the only one that happened when I was about 15 years old. But for time's sake and length, I'll keep it to that and a couple other experiences that hit home the most over the last 30 years. Before that, I learned how real they were via footprints, weird happenings around the house, howling, mumbling, and everything else these great apes or beasts do. They have some pretty crazy behavioral practices, and to be honest, frightening too, especially when you're a child experiencing them. So for the first time I remembered hearing about these things, I was about 10 years old. I think about a year after moving to Sixes. It was over breakfast when my mom had said she had heard someone outside the house the night before. I don't remember too much of the conversation now, but I do recall my dad a bit worried about it and mentioned he'd heard it too. But on a couple of previous nights, not that night. He was worried enough to bring out his rifle, I noticed, and set it by their bed from then on out. Whispers and windows. My first personal experience happened by my window in my bedroom one spring night. It was really scary. I mean, really, really scary. I recall it was pretty late and warm for an early spring night. My mother left my window cracked that night. And since the issue of worrying of something outside their window and running around the property faded after a few months of nothing, she thought nothing of it, I suppose. I was asleep but woke suddenly. I felt fearful. I felt a sense of dread all of a sudden, and I didn't know why. But, well, I would learn why shortly. After what seemed I heard what seemed like whispering and mumbling and some movement outside my window. I was about 11 years old at the time of this incident, or somewhere right around there. And while I was never afraid of the dark before, I was now, and after that, for a long time. The whispering sounds were weird. They were deep, raspy, like my aunt who smoked too much and sounded like a scratchy record when she spoke. This was like that, but deep and a bit menacing too. I jumped up quickly to shut my window, and as I did, a large shadow moved off from next to it, passing in front of it, causing all the natural light to disappear for a second and leaving me in total darkness. I heard something run, something that had to be huge, with the thudding of each step as it moved off. And then out of nowhere, some crazy, scary holler or yell of sorts not far away. I screamed and ran to my parents' bedroom. Suffice it to say, they believed me, and my window was shut and locked from then on. Mom and the Beast. The next event I was a part of, but it was my mother who would see something that would scare the life near out of her. She saw, well, she called it a beast and monster. We were home. My dad was on a work-related trip to Salem, Oregon. It had to do with a farming and some legislation that was coming out soon and would affect his business big time. And he wanted to help stop it, which they did, but eventually, decades later, well, here we are, in the mess anyways. My mom was in the backyard getting some gardening done. I was back there too, but on the porch. I don't remember exactly what I was doing, but I think I was reading some comic books. Either way, however, I was there. I looked over at her and realized she was on her knees in the garden, but not tending the garden. She was looking out towards the mountains, and below them, Six's River. Her attention seemed, well, pretty attuned to whatever it was she was looking at. I watched for a second or so, and she finally shook her head and went back to gardening, and I went back to reading, or whatever I was doing at the time. And I swear I was reading, now that I think about it, more about that day. I think I was a Superman comic book where he died. Yeah, I remember now it was. But anyways, my mom finally looked back at the garden and toiled away and asked me to grab some iced tea for her. Up until that moment, again, we had no real voices, visuals, or anything else of the strange happenings in a couple, 2-3 months. I heard her saying something as I was in the kitchen getting her tea and realized she was saying, "Get the gun, get the gun." It was somewhat a relaxed voice, which was weird. I mean, seriously, when you need your gun, you shouldn't be yelling it out. You should be yelling it out. But she was calm. Get the gun. At least, it seemed that way. I came out of the house with a gun in one hand, tea in the other. She kept her eyes on the woods and was waving me closer in her hand with her hands and arms. She was in a hurry for that tea, or gun, I thought. It was the gun, of course. She practically yanked it out of my hands, chambered a bullet, and left the safety off. Suddenly, she started backing up slowly, with me behind her, until we reached the porch, and at that moment grabbed my arm so hard and yanked me inside that I spilled the tea all over myself. She shut the door, locked it, and stood next to the window looking out it, while holding the phone to her ear until she heard my dad's voice on the other end of the line. She said, I remember, it is in the backyard. What do I do? Muffled comments I heard from my dad. Then she said, okay, and hung up, only to call the sheriff's department seconds after that. The deputies came, and rather quick for being out in the sixes. They looked around, but found nothing. I remember my mother trying to explain to them what she saw, but they refused to believe it and told her it was probably a person, although a rather tall person, and most likely homeless and passing through, trying to score some free food in the garden that they might have noticed. They told her they must have noticed her and realized that someone was home and well armed, so they took off. My mother would have none of it. She saw a beast. My dad returned later that evening. My mother told him what she saw, and for the next few weeks, well, we heard them, and my dad swore there were shadows in the night passing through the yard and property. Once in the middle of the night, I woke to a gunshot. My dad said he scared off a bear, but I knew in his eyes and tone that He was just trying to save me from real terror or fear. Reins on me were pretty tight for that summer, and the rest of the year, I recall. I had to be watched when playing outside, and when friends came over to spend a night or something, they thought my parents were simply overprotective. And they were, and for good reason. Bigfoot was about on our property. I saw it. A few years later, I would see one for myself. I had turned 15 years old at the time, or about to be 15. Of course, the Bigfoot thing was still part of our lives, but I had come to learn it was pretty seasonal. They were only here about 6 to 7 months out of the year. Yeah, it made for a life of wearing eyes in the back of your head, a normal thing, but eventually I ventured off, out and off the property a bit, and down the road occasionally, to a friend's house who lived a half-mile down the road, and could go to the river and fish, alone. My mother did prefer I take a .22 handgun we had, and I did, most of the time at least. There was one incident that year, around the end of spring, that had the hair on my neck standing on end, though. Before my visual of these things, I heard the sound of breathing and soon mumbling outside my window. Again, in the middle of the night. However, by the time I was nearing 15, I had at least enough guts to go over and shut the window, lock it, and not peek outside. I thought at the time that there was no sense in frightening or even worrying myself any more than I was at the time. Before I shut the window, I did listen for a few and swear it was a language of some kind I could hear, not just grumbles and grunts. I believe they are some kind of primate, and even primates have a particular language, as in vocalizations that give others a sense of what they are feeling, whether it is a form of endearment or a sharp warning. This was much like that. Even a couple times when I swore I felt like a sharp warning from one of them was being given to another. Not once did I feel beckoned to the window, as some kids I've heard felt, but it was scary nonetheless. It was deep sounding. It had a weird high pitch almost to it when it would trail off sometimes in the language. Either way, it was definitely weird and scary at the time. And by the time I had grown a pretty deep interest in them. These Bigfoot that roamed our property from time to time. The Great Orange Ape. I was going to do some fishing down by the river that evening, kind of a celebration of sorts. It was the last week of that spring before I was out of school for summer vacation. It was actually a mostly cloudy day, warm. Well, actually, it was hot, muggy, and some sprinkles would come and go. But for the most part, I still needed my hat and sunglasses, which is pretty typical of the Pacific Northwest for that time of the year. Anyways, I was fishing when I saw something move not too far from me, just across the river. It was just, I guess, standing behind a tree, a huge Douglas fir that at the base was big enough to hide even this thing. It seemed as if a really tall something or other was leaning out from behind it and then hiding again. But the creepiest part was it seemed to be looking in my direction. At first I thought it could have been a bear, a black bear in fact, climbing the tree and looking over in my direction, oblivious to me actually being there. But the third time this thing leaned out from behind the tree, I could tell it was more humanoid than a bear, or any other animal I knew of. And I was suddenly gripped with fear, so much so I could not move. It stood out from behind the trees seconds later, revealing itself completely, at least as much as I could see from nearly 40 to 50 yards away, but it was clear enough to see it was one of those monsters my mom had feared so much of. A Bigfoot stood there, plain as day, giant, massive in width, I remembered, and covered in a burnt orange hair everywhere. It seemed to just stare at me, and while I could not see its facial expressions, its body was hunched, with arms dangling near its knees, staring right at me. I knew I was in danger. There were 2 ways back to my house. The shortest one would take me upriver, the same direction this thing was in. The other was longer, roundabout, I guess you'd say, and it would take me a few minutes before I could even cut back towards home. It swayed there suddenly, back and forth and back and forth, this orange beast of a thing. Then I could hear a rumble of sorts, like a low grumbling growl. I looked at this thing for what seemed an eternity. but was mere seconds before it simply turned and in less than 3 steps vanished into the forest like a ghost. I ran, and I took the shorter trail I'd come in on all the way home. Me and Pat. My mother was freaked out, to say the least. So much so, she wanted to move. We stayed, however. Work is work. But I'm glad we did in the end. Like I said, me and Pat do some research here, and we have some pretty decent vocalizations, a few prints here and there, but no real visuals since then. Well, nothing, but maybe a shadow or two at the most over the years. But that is my encounter story, Dave. Thanks again, Rob.